Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you to this Assembly, I'd like to introduce some guests in the West Gallery, Mr. Speaker. They're here with the Canadian Association of Midwives and also the Provincial Association as well, Mr. Speaker. We have E.B. Heller, who's the Director of Policy and Communications for the Canadian Association of Midwives. Natalie Pambrin, who's the President of the Canadian Association of Midwives. We have Jessica Bailey, who's President of the Midwives Association of Saskatchewan, and Evelyn George, who is representative with the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity yesterday to meet with E.B., Natalie, and Jessica. We had, I think, a great meeting. I want to thank them for the presentation they gave, and we're looking forward to following up with them in the future. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all members of the Assembly to please welcome these guests to the Legislative Assembly.
I recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join in with the Minister opposite in welcoming these guests to the West Gallery today. We had a chance to chat with them on Monday and hear the presentation that the Minister is talking about. A lot of important work being done by this group. You know, we're talking about people who have gathered together and volunteered their time for a great cause in this province, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank them for the advocacy that they're doing and ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their Assembly today.
Here. I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the West Gallery, we have a fine group of 36th grade 10 students from F.W. Johnson Collegiate here in Regina, of course. Their teacher is Scott McKillop, and Shay Pelche is also accompanying them this afternoon. Look forward to have a little chat with them after routine proceedings this afternoon. I ask all members to help me welcome them here today.
I recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming the students from F.W. Johnson, which I think is actually in my constituency, but no. These boundaries get a little bit fuzzy, but in any event, Mr. Speaker, many of the students from F.W. Johnson would come from Regina Northeast, and I'm pleased that they can join us here today to watch the proceedings in their Assembly, and I'd like to ask with the Minister that all members join in welcoming them to their Assembly.
I recognize the Minister of Trade and Export.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce a gentleman who I think needs little introduction in this chamber, who has been a member and a minister, the Honourable Rob Norris. I'm seated behind the bar, and Rob is currently working with the Canadian Light Source in the University of Saskatchewan as the Senior Government Relations Officer for CLS. So if everyone would join me in welcoming Rob to his Assembly.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the official opposition, as someone who served with Rob Norris, it's an honour to have him here in the Assembly. We miss his vocabulary prowess in this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. I think that we've simplified a lot of exchanges since his departure. We do thank him for his continued service to his province, though, in his current role. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, and sitting in your gallery, I would like to introduce a good friend of mine, Kevin Graham. And Kevin is here as a senior management person from the Borgo Industries, a company in my constituency that we all appreciate. He is here for a North American Energy Conference and is not a big fan of the soul-sucking carbon tax, as it would cost his company hundreds of thousands of dollars, Mr. Speaker. A fun fact about Kevin is he and I had a wager that he couldn't run a donkey's rear end in our constituency and win, but here I am. So So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the member for Arm River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a soul-sucking carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens from the Battleford and also North Battleford. I do so present.
Recognize the member for John Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens and businesses from all across the province, from communities across the province, as it relates to really what's the epitome of a job-killing, soul-sucking tax in the imposition of the PST onto construction labor, Mr. Speaker. Of course, in this case, we had the Sask Party government see a slowing economy, and they chose to hit the brakes, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the consequences have been devastating for many local businesses across our province, certainly for households, Mr. Speaker, who are now paying $800 more per year in PST in just over a 4-year period of time. That's a 70% increase. We see that in things like our retail sales, Mr. Speaker, where they're completely flat over a 5-year period, Mr. Speaker. And of course, we see the devastation within our construction industry. We see permits down across the province. We see important projects being shelved. We know that thousands of Saskatchewan tradespeople, construction workers have lost their jobs, so many that have been forced outside of our province, Mr. Speaker. Amen. And the prayer reads as follows. Amen. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents from Saskatoon and Regina. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition on the Regina Bypass project. The people who have submitted this petition today would like to bring to our attention the following. That very few details about the Regina Bypass project are public available without redactions, despite it being the costliest infrastructure project funded by taxpayers in the province's history. Ministry officials have identified and documented major deficiencies in the project. They were in an email that has yet to be released in full for public review, despite repeated requests on this side, Mr. Speaker. In the Assembly, the previous Minister of Highways referenced the breach of an aquifer in Wascana Creek as an example of one of these major deficiencies. However, our current Minister of Highways has repeatedly stated on record that there are no major deficiencies on this bypass. Mr. Speaker, this is a very curious conundrum and one that would be easily fixable if this petition were ever to be followed. Saskatchewan people will be paying for this piece of infrastructure for the next 30 years. And obviously, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of government transparency, these contradictory statements require clarification. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately release a full unredacted copy of records detailing all minor and major deficiencies identified in the Regina Bypass project to date. Mr. Speaker, perhaps in committee next week we can get that list. The people that have signed this petition today are from the City of Moose Jaw. I so submit.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside Saskatchewan, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties.
And we know, though, that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. But, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. And we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to overhaul Saskatchewan campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from the city of Lloydminster. I do so present. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for critical workplace supports for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who signed this petition wish to bring to our attention the following. Saskatchewan has the highest rates of domestic violence amongst all of the provinces in Canada, and employers should take every reasonable precaution in the workplace to protect workers who are survivors of domestic violence, and that 5 days of paid leave and up to 17 weeks of unpaid leave be made available to workers who are survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, this is what we've called for in our private member's bill. I believe it's the third or fourth time since we put forward this legislation. I think the first time we did it was back in 2016, Mr. Speaker. We're not asking for the Sask Party to do anything that doesn't exist in other jurisdictions, which is the least we can really do here in Saskatchewan. Some form of paid days leave exist in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland and Labrador. It's time for this government to stop dragging their feet and pass this legislation. I'd like to read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to pass legislation to ensure critical supports in the workplace include reasonable accommodation and paid and unpaid leave for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this petition today come from Regina and Melville. I do so present.
Hear, hear. I recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition on seed regulations to the Government of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, the residents signing this petition wish to bring to our attention that the federal government is proposing to pass regulations that would enable plant breeders to charge farmers royalties on crops which they have grown, and it would give plant breeders total control over plant varieties registered after February 2015. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners want to draw to our attention that the current proposals by the federal government would not give any guarantee that any of the royalties will be devoted to research. They don't provide any guarantee that the research would return the value of the research to farmers, and nor is there any guarantee that the research would be on Canadian crop varieties. Mr. Speaker, the current model of government and farmer-funded research has generated up to 20-to-1 returns for the Canadian public and farmers, and the petitioners in the prayer respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Saskatchewan Party government to advocate on behalf of Saskatchewan farmers with the federal government to ensure that the rights of farmers to freely use their own seed are established and maintained, that endpoint and trailing royalties will not be imposed on farmers, and that any seed research paid for by farmers will be controlled and directed by farmers. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners signing this petition are from Lloydminster and Marshall, and I so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the International Day of Pink. The IDP goes back as far as 2007 when two students decided to stand against bullying and support their classmate who was being harassed for their sexual orientation. Wearing pink aims to raise awareness against homophobia, transphobia, transmisogyny, and all forms of bullying. It's a day to say that we will not tolerate violence in our communities, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the Day of Pink is a day for expressing kindness, compassion, and courage. Mr. Speaker, in our province, almost 2 out of 3 high school students are bullied. Bullying has long-lasting effects on a child's well-being. It's a complex issue, but we all must take the time to educate ourselves about the issues that LGBT youth are facing in our communities. Some institutions like the university, through the UR Pride, created a space where clinical counseling to gender and sexual diverse young individuals is provided. This year, a new initiative called our History Initiative will be launched to provide resources to schools, community centers, libraries, organizations, offices, and workplaces to raise further awareness about sexual diversity and the need for more tolerance and acceptance. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members join with me and stand up for our youth. We must come together in addressing bullying and discrimination in Saskatchewan, not only on the Day of Pink, but every day. Thank you.
You're here.
I recognize a member for Lumsden Morse.
Speaker, today we wear our daffodils proudly in support of the Canadian Cancer Society. The daffodil became a symbol of the Cancer Society following the lead of a group of volunteers who, at a fundraiser, chose the daffodil to decorate their table in order to convey a message of hope. Through the month of April, the Cancer Society will be selling fresh daffodils and daffodil pins to raise funds for cancer research. Today, we were very fortunate to be visited by 7-year-old Logan Stevens, who presented us with flowers. Funds raised by Logan and his friend Rowan, who couldn't make it today, and many others will go towards supporting those living with cancers, celebrating those in remission, and to honor those who have lost their battle with this terrible disease. Mr. Speaker, our government understands the challenges faced by cancer patients, and that is why the Cancer Society, Saskatchewan Cancer Society, will receive nearly $8 million in additional funding, increasing SCA's budget to $178 million. That's a 127% increase, Mr. Speaker, since 2007. The new funding will support the addition of 18 oncology drugs to the formulary and the recruitment of additional oncologists. I encourage all members to please join me in thanking the Canadian Cancer Society for their ongoing contributions to cancer research and in supporting Daffodil Month by buying a fresh daffodil or a daffodil pin. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise today to highlight the Canadian Cancer Society's Daffodil campaign. Since the 1940s, the Canadian Cancer Society has been funding research to put an end to cancer for good. Today, the organization has grown to be the largest national charitable funder of research and accounts for more than 1/3 of the country's overall charitable investment in cancer research. The charity offers programs and services to help people with cancer and their families when they're unsure or when they're anxious, like 7-year-old Logan Stevens, who is here today handing out daffodils. Logan has had his own brave fight with cancer, and I think that I speak for all members when I say that we wish you, Logan, and your family all the best. I would like to take this time to also recognize the wonderful volunteers at the Canadian Cancer Society who raise funds to support this extremely important work. My thoughts are with the many Canadians who live with this disease every day and their loved ones who support them during this difficult time. By supporting the Daffodil campaign, we can help people with cancer see life beyond their diagnosis. When we donate, we're helping people live their lives to the fullest. I encourage all members of this House and all Canadians to donate and to wear the daffodil pin in support of cancer awareness this spring.
Recognize the member for Martensville-Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week is National Volunteer Week. To celebrate, 15 individuals from across our province were awarded with the Saskatchewan Volunteer Medal yesterday. The recipients have donated their time and energy to different organizations around their communities and are very deserving of this recognition. This year's recipients were Christine Boychuk from Moose Jaw, my own constituent Ben Bueller from Osler, David Burke from Kindersley, Janet Caldwell from Meadow Lake, Nelson Eng from Regina, the Reverend Alvin Hingley from Humboldt, Sil and Ividel Kewick from Saskatoon, Myrna Nagy from Prince Albert, Tina Poole from Prince Albert, Edna Poncelet from Grandora, Barb Ryan from Regina, Mary Walters from Pilot Butte, and Robert Demure of Fort Capel and Audrey Height from Kindersley were recognized as recipients of the 2017 medal. Mr. Speaker, the dedication of these volunteers to their communities should serve as an inspiration to us all. The 2018 recipients will be joining the ranks of 204 exemplary volunteers that have been recognized in the past, and they should be very proud of that, Mr. Speaker, and I know that we are all very proud of them. I now ask all members to join me in again congratulating the 2018 Saskatchewan Volunteer Medal recipients.
Recognize the member for Kelvington-Wadena. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, March 16th, the member from Kenora-Pelly and I had the privilege of volunteer cooking at a benefit in support of Ori Bebachuk and his parents Jason and Cindy in Invermay. Mr. Speaker, on December 31st, Ori was involved in a snowmobile accident resulting in paralysis from above the waist down. By all accounts, this 19-year-old is an inspiration to all who have the opportunity to be in his company. In high school, he was a competitor in Skills Canada competitions in the outdoor power and recreation category, winning successive gold medals. He was lauded as an enthusiastic outdoorsman, involved in numerous activities, and a great friend to many, both young and old. Mr. Speaker, in true Saskatchewan fashion, the community gathered to raise funds for the Babachuk family to make alterations to their home to accommodate wheelchair accessibility and to help defray other expenses in Ori's period of adjustment. Some 400 people turned out in a community with a population of 275. While I'm not aware of the final tally, it's estimated that well in excess of $60,000 was raised by the community for Ori. Mr. Speaker, the comments from those in attendance and from family members has me convinced that Ori will overcome any physical challenges he has and will be an enormous contributor to his community and to the province. The generosity of this rural community makes one very proud to be a Saskatchewanian. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina University.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today to congratulate the Boldest Golden Suns 5A girls team on their back-to-back provincial titles in the final at Hoopla held in Saskatoon. Winning the provincial final was a perfect end to a perfect tournament, as they did not drop a game that entire weekend. The Golden Suns led for the entire game, although there were tense moments near the end where Saskatoon's Centennial team looked like they might be making a comeback. Mr. Speaker, the confidence and determination for the Golden Suns to win that provincial title was felt by all in the gym that night. The top scorers for that evening were Jade Belmore with 15 points, Kelsey Strachuk with 10 points, as well as Cameron Moore with 10. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Boldest boys team fell short of their 5A provincial final, but they also have a very long tradition of dominance. I would also like to congratulate another school in my constituency, the Regina Christian Grizzlies, as they celebrated their third consecutive provincial championship in the 3A boys final. Mr. Speaker, I now ask all members to please join me in congratulating the athletes, coaches and staff on a very successful basketball season. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, April 10th, marks the International Day of Pink. On this day, communities from across our province and our world will unite to celebrate our diversity as well as to raise awareness to stop homophobia, transphobia, and transmisogyny, and all other forms of bullying. This initiative started in Nova Scotia in the wake of a student being bullied because of their sexual orientation and the pink-colored shirt they were wearing. 2 students intervened and came to the support of their classmate who was being bullied and bought pink shirts. A few days later, everyone at their school was wearing pink, standing together in solidarity. By wearing this shirt, students took an incredible stand against bullying and began working together to prevent any other forms of homophobic and transphobic bullying. Mr. Speaker, their message is very clear, and I quote, "Anyone can bully, and any can be victimized by bullying, but together we can stop it," end quote. By wearing our pink shirts, we are reaffirming our commitment to stand up against discrimination of any kind. The pink shirt is a symbol of diversity, reminding us that we must celebrate our differences. I now ask my colleagues to join me in recognizing April 10th as Pink Shirt Day.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is Day of Pink, an important day for action against bullying, homophobia, transphobia, and transmisogyny. and I'm glad to see that recognized by so many people supporting Pink today. Today we also have an election campaign underway in Alberta. And in that election, a central issue has become the views of Mr. Jason Kenney regarding GSAs. He'd like to change the rules. He'd like to change the rules to allow teachers to inform parents if a student chooses to join a GSA, Mr. Speaker. Now, this could put an important strain on young people who are seeking support and safety, could put an important strain on them, and even put lives at risk, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier today is, does he share the views of Mr. Kenney when it comes to GSAs?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I am very soon, shortly after the Alberta election and potentially a federal election, I'm going to be running to be Premier of not Alberta but Saskatchewan.
Hear, hear.
Speaker, in Saskatchewan, we have a policy throughout our school divisions, Mr. Speaker, at the request of the Minister of the Day, Mr. Speaker, a policy with respect to providing a GSA for our students upon request, Mr. Speaker, a request that came from the Minister of the Day, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that children in our Saskatchewan school system, all children in our Saskatchewan school system have the opportunity to be safe, Mr. Speaker, in their school and in their community, Mr. Speaker. That policy was put in place and is balanced, Mr. Speaker, with the responsibility of the schools themselves to ensure the safety and security of the children that attend there, Mr. Speaker. And it respects the confidentiality of each of those students, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, does the Premier believe that students should be the ones who have the right to decide whether and how they will inform their parents, or should that be left up to others? And if that is the case, if he does believe that's the case, what is in place to make sure that that is what happens and that students are protected from that eventuality?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just said that the confidentiality of the students who are requesting the formation of a gay-straight alliance, Mr. Speaker, in their school is respected, Mr. Speaker. That's respected as per the policy, Mr. Speaker, and the Ministry of Education encourages and supports our school divisions across the province to have discussions with respect to the policy development and the safe practices that we have in our school, Mr. Speaker. So that confidentiality is respected, Mr. Speaker. It's respected at the request of the Minister of the Day, Mr. Speaker, in the policies that are available in our schools across this province.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good that that confidentiality is respected. The question is it protected? Is there anything in place to actually protect students should they wind up in a situation where someone might inform their parents without their consent? Where is that protection in place in this province? And if it's not here, what will this government do to bring it in?
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, as the Premier stated, Mr. Speaker, we believe that we want students to be safe, Mr. Speaker, and we want them to be who they are. We believe in diversity and we believe in inclusion, Mr. Speaker, and we believe in the tenets of the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Code, Mr. Speaker, legislation which has been changed on the floor of this legislature with the consent of both houses, Mr. Speaker. But in 2013, Mr. Speaker, the Human Rights Commission said the school must ensure that individual privacy is protected and information is kept confidential, Mr. Speaker, and that's with respect to the child's decision as to whether he wants to join a GSA or not, Mr. Speaker. We respect the provisions, we respect the decision, the comments that have come from the Human Rights Commission, Mr. Speaker, and we have no intention of violating that trust that's been given to us by the Commission.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Other provinces across the country have recognized the importance of going further than simply recognizing and respecting, but actually putting in place policies and legislation that will protect students. Now, we're joined today in the East Gallery by Kat Haynes, who works with the UR Pride Centre for Sexuality and Gender Diversity. And they do great work here in Regina, on and off campus, helping support people in the LGBTQ+ community, in particular helping students to start GSAs and have support to do so. And what their experience has been is that while that policy is in place as a general recommendation, it's not necessarily being followed, and students are facing barriers to the formation of GSAs in our schools. So my question for the Premier is, in what way has this policy been communicated clearly, not just to school boards, but to teachers, to students, so that it's very clear that they have this right, and also what their recourse should be if that right is not respected? If they aren't able to see this put in place, what's their next step?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, there is a policy, Mr. Speaker, allowing kids in our school system to form GSAs or other organizations that they so choose, Mr. Speaker, and their membership in those groups is kept confidential. I'll tell you what the next step is, Mr. Speaker. The next step is to inform the Minister of Education that there's a challenge within a particular school division or a particular school with regard to the creation of a GSA. And I'll take steps to fix that, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you this, that in my time as the Minister of Education, it's been over a year now, I haven't had one complaint from a student with respect to their ability to form a GSA. But if the member opposite, if the Leader of the Opposition has an example of where a student has requested to form a GSA in a school, Mr. Speaker, I want to know about it because we'll deal with it. The school divisions have all supported the creation of the policy that's been developed by the Ministry of Education in consultation with parents and school divisions and teachers, Mr. Speaker. But I'd like to know the answer to that question because we'll deal with it post haste.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the wrong place to put the weight of this is on students. On students who are experiencing fear. Tell it to a kid who wants to form a GSA at their school but isn't getting support. They need to call the Minister of Education. Tell it to a kid who wants to join a GSA but is scared that their parents will be informed without their consent. Tell them that this is just fine and that they've got enough protection. The fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is we don't really need to know what the Premier thinks about Mr. Kenney's stance because we've already got that situation here. We don't have legislation in place that protects students and makes sure that GSAs will be formed when students want them. Will the Premier stand up today and make it clear that we're not going to go down the road of Kenney and go backwards the way he wants to take us in Alberta, but actually go forward and improve supports, improve protection for kids in this province?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
I can categorically state for the record, Mr. Speaker, that this government supports students in their desires to create GSAs, Mr. Speaker. That policy has been developed in consultation with teachers, with school divisions, and with parents, Mr. Speaker. But again, I ask the member, if he has an example of where a student hasn't been allowed to form a GSA, then I need to know about that, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not really sure, Mr. Speaker, what difference it would make if we were to develop legislation on the point. It still creates the issue, Mr. Speaker. But there's been lots of consultation, Mr. Speaker, with teachers. There's an ability for kids to reach out within their schools, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that they get the support that they need, Mr. Speaker, and that will always be the position of this government, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to support children in their choices, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to ensure that their confidentiality is maintained.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sport is so important to our kids, and it can be so positive. It's a huge part of our society and our culture. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't want to turn it into the worst experience of their lives. Earlier this year, a joint investigation by CBC News and Sports revealed that at least 220 coaches who were involved in amateur sports in Canada have been convicted of sexual offences in the past 20 years, involving more than 600 victims under the age of 18. And the cases of another 34 accused coaches are currently before the courts. The scary part, Mr. Speaker, is these are just the cases we know about. Earlier this week, I questioned the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport in committee about his plan to address this issue through the ministry. I have to say, I was troubled that he did not have a clear plan to address this at the provincial level. To the Minister, what steps has he taken since our committee discussion? How is this government planning to seriously address sexual abuse in sport?
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important issue. I thank the member opposite for bringing it up. Mr. Speaker, we're working hard to reduce abuse, discrimination, harassment in all its forms in every sector, obviously in the sports sector as well. It's very important. I was able to attend the FPT earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, where all the provinces as well as the federal government had the Red Deer Declaration for the prevention of harassment, abuse and discrimination in sport. So there, as a result of that, there's the FPT working group working on this, led by Sports Canada. It's pairing programming in support of the declaration. And there's pilot projects and other work being done at the federal level, Mr. Speaker. In our province, since 2013, our government is led by Sheldon Kennedy's group Respect in Sport program in our province, online training for coaches. I'm pleased to announce 45,000 coaches have completed that, Mr. Speaker. This is, there's programming through the Red Cross as well. It's many organizations within the sporting community require criminal record checks and vulnerable sector checks as well. This is a very important issue, as I mentioned, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work hard on this, and this is a nonpartisan issue, and I would take any suggestions from anywhere, including from the members opposite.
I recognize a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, experts have called this the tip of the iceberg. This is very troubling information, and we can't ignore these findings. And there needs to be massive reform across the sports system to ensure every child who participates in sport has a safe, positive experience. Mr. Speaker, 20 years ago, the case of Graham James made national headlines and was thought to be a major wake-up call for amateur sport world in Canada. The focus must be on keeping our kids safe and not simply coaching or training our coaches better, as was suggested in committee and just now. Has the minister followed up with his officials? What's the plan going forward here in Saskatchewan today?
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a culture change that needs to be required, not just in the sports area, but in all areas within our society, Mr. Speaker. We all have to be very vigilant. Parents have to be vigilant. Coaches, everyone. The criminal justice system has to be involved with this. This is wide-ranging as well, and it's very important. Of course, we need a safe place, not only within our schools, Mr. Speaker, but we need them in our sporting community, and it's so important, and we all have to be very vigilant. We'll continue to work on the things that we've mentioned before, and Mr. Speaker, we'll continue on. SAS Sport is doing good work in this area within each of the sport governing bodies, within each sports. Again, we all have to be very vigilant, and we'll continue to work hard, and again, we will take any suggestions of further things we can do, again, not only in sport, but right across society and in all sectors of government, Mr. Speaker. And again, something that's, there's been in the past in this province, there's been some bad experiences, and we never want to see that with our children, particularly in any area, but certainly in sports. So lots of work to do, and we'll continue to work on it.
I recognize a member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, joining us today is film director Sobe Charles Ume, as well as the co-producer Charles. They are currently shooting and producing a movie in the Queen City in an effort to restore the film employment tax credit to build a film industry in this province once again. The cast and crew are made up entirely of people who call Saskatchewan home. This was not an easy task, as I'm sure you can imagine, as those that were involved in the industry, so many of them were forced to move from this province to other provinces where the industry is booming after this government cut the film tax credit. Our industry is now a fraction of what it once was, only $21 million in 2017, while our provincial neighbours are booming. More than $200 million next door in Manitoba, even more in Alberta, and of course billions of dollars in British Columbia and Ontario. Mr. Speaker, why can't the Sask Party government support the film industry to grow the economy and create jobs, just like our neighbours to the east and west, and like provinces all across Canada?
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been brought up many times before in the past and continues to do, I see here today. So several years ago in 2012, this government made a difficult decision to wind down the FETC. We made the decision to get out of the Hollywood bidding war. So instead, we're focused on investing in right here in Saskatchewan through Creative Saskatchewan. I think the programs we have available through Creative Saskatchewan on the film side would help our local entrepreneurs and sort of those smaller productions that tell Saskatchewan stories, Mr. Speaker. And not only in the film area, Mr. Speaker, there's it's all parts of the creative sectors, Mr. Speaker. The recording area, Mr. Speaker. We've seen good work in interactive digital and several other galleries. All the industry associations that make up our arts and culture scene, Mr. Speaker. So again, not just in the film area. There was a reception here earlier where all members attended, and there was seemed to be good support from that. So, Mr. Speaker, again, made a difficult decision a few years ago. The money has to come from somewhere, and so...
Next question. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, the results speak for themselves. That was a bad decision, Mr. Speaker, and the industry has been decimated. It's a fraction of what it was. It must be tough for that minister who used to really get results for Saskatchewan people to have to sort of spin that yarn, Mr. Speaker. You know, the filmmakers that are with us here today certainly aren't feeling supported by this government. That's right. According to them, the grant process is cumbersome, and they feel the government just don't care about the economic spin-offs that come from this very important industry. And we know the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce also recognizes this missed opportunity. And a recently released report from Stats Canada paints the picture of the damage that's been caused by the choice of this government to cancel this film tax credit. Revenue is now half of what it was just a decade ago. This is a direct result of this government's choice to axe the film employment tax credit. Mr. Speaker, at a time with a lower Canadian dollar and a world-class soundstage, this industry should have boomed in Saskatchewan, driving investment and creating jobs. Instead, it was decimated by the Sask Party government. Why won't this government, why won't this minister do the right thing and reverse that damaging choice, reinstate the film tax credit, and build this industry back in Saskatchewan?
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
So, Mr. Speaker, again, difficult decisions were made several years ago. We replaced the film employment tax credit with a grant system. It provides upfront money. There is a cap on it, however. I understand that, Mr. Speaker, but there's only so much money to go around. Mr. Speaker, the member noted other provinces within our confederation, Mr. Speaker, that have increased their investment or the amount of money they put towards their film industry, Mr. Speaker. But there are several of them are running deficits. Several of them receive equalization. Mr. Speaker, in Manitoba, a report on their film tax credit found the money given out by the province exceeded the money it recouped through higher income taxes and other sources in only 4 of the 5 years, Mr. Speaker. So, again, we made the difficult decision many years ago now to get out of the Hollywood bidding war. Our government's focus on investing in Saskatchewan-based entrepreneurs, not only in film, but in several other the creative sectors, Mr. Speaker. I could go on to the list of all this support we've given to the arts and creative sector if there's another question.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, that must be a tough spot for that minister to watch an O-lineman tap dance like that, Mr. Speaker, but this was a bad decision for this province. That small investment that was put forward returned itself many times over economically. The right thing to do is to leverage that world-class soundstage to reinstate that tax credit, put people back to work, to drive investment and build that industry once again. Why can't that minister make that commitment here today?
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
So again, Mr. Speaker, we're proud to support the arts and culture right here in Saskatchewan through Creative, through the Arts Board, through the Lottery Fund, Mr. Speaker, roughly $32 million annually and thousands of grants over the years, Mr. Speaker. We've had many successes in the creative sector, Mr. Speaker. Artists who have been nominated for Junos. We've done some different creative funds through the film area, Mr. Speaker, interactive digital media, micro-budget feature, web series production grant to help those smaller up-and-coming film producers here in the province of Saskatchewan. So, Mr. Speaker, we make tough decisions. We have to understand where all the money goes within the province and all the expenditures, Mr. Speaker. What we won't do, Mr. Speaker, we won't lose money on film studios like the members opposite did when they were in government at a time, Mr. Speaker, when health...
Next question. Recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, Dr. Gavin Van Deventer, the Chief of Staff for Meadow Lake Hospital, described the exodus of physicians from Meadow Lake as unprecedented. There are only 13 family physicians working in the community, and 6 are set to leave within the next 6 months. He says he can't see how that many physicians can be recruited in so little time and in the current working conditions. The community risks facing longer waits to see family doctors and more people showing up in ERs as a result. Van Deventer says Meadow Lake needs between 15 and 18 physicians to provide quality care to patients, and the current workload and pay structure won't be enough to recruit the doctors the community needs. What actions are being taken now to recruit and retain the doctors needed in the community of Meadow Lake? What's the plan to make sure people in Meadow Lake can see a doctor?
I recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to stand and answer to these questions from the member opposite today. We're aware that there may be a pending shortage in Meadow Lake come this summer. Mr. Speaker, over the last number of years I've worked with the SMA, and they've been working with their physicians to ask them to give ample time when there's a group or there's any physicians thinking about leaving a town. And that isn't always the case, so we do have, of course, PRAS, the Physician Recruitment Agency, SaskDocs, that is always actively working to recruit physicians, Mr. Speaker. We also know that the SHA is has a working group that's been established to secure locum coverage to backfill these possible shortages come summertime. And SaskDocs has also been working with Meadow Lake to recruit additional physicians through their postings, as I just mentioned, Mr. Speaker. We know of the 6 physicians that are leaving, 2 are moving to British Columbia. That's actually a couple. 3 are IMGs that have finished their requirements and are moving back to their home of Ontario. 1 is leaving for personal reasons, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to the numbers of physicians and what's required in the town, I'm happy to answer that in any upcoming questions.
I recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no maybe or possibly about this. This is the Chief of Staff of the hospital that's raising these alarms. Mr. Speaker, as it is now, doctors in Meadow Lake are often working 100+ hours a week and have been on call every night for months. The minister needs to pull out all the stops to get working conditions under control and to ensure that doctors are compensated for the work they do for the people of Meadow Lake and surrounding areas. Just as concerning, come September, there will only be 2 doctors who can perform anesthesia and just 1 qualified to perform cesarean sections, with potential to impact surgeries and deliveries. We already have huge gaps in obstetrical care in northeastern Saskatchewan, and now we're set to see the same thing happen in the northwest. The ministry has acknowledged this doctor shortage will lead to service disruptions. To the minister, what will be disrupted? What services can the community of Meadow Lake plan to no longer expect?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, only a few short years ago when the members opposite were in government, what did we see? people screaming for doctors throughout all of Saskatchewan, particularly in rural Saskatchewan. That's why we increased the training positions from 60 to 100. That's why I increased the residency positions, much of them in rural areas, from 60 to 120. That's why we increased the benefits to physicians. We have the most competitive compensation rates in the country when it comes to physicians. We have some of the best bonuses for physicians in rural areas. Out of the 100 graduates we have coming out of the U of S now, Mr. Speaker, previously with only 60, we retained about 57%. Now we're retaining 75% of those 100. Many of them are realizing that career choice in rural Saskatchewan is a good choice, Mr. Speaker. We now have over 900 more doctors working than under the members opposite, not to mention 3,700 more nurses of all designations, many other disciplines, Mr. Speaker. We'll take no lessons from them when it comes to backfilling positions in rural Saskatchewan.
Ministerial statements, introduction of bills, presenting reports by standing and special committees, orders of the day.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 168, the Justices of the Peace Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to enter into the debates, the adjourned debates on Bill number 168, the Justice of the Peace Amendment Act 2019.
Order, please. Recognize the member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's very few changes that are being proposed here. It's a very short bill, 1 page, although it is bilingual, so of course there are 2 pages, actually more in French as usual. The bill is looking at some changes to, regarding salaries of the Justice of the Peace, and is fairly straightforward. It will include all justices of the peace now in the Public Employees Pension Plan, which is the Public Service Pension Plan. A few housekeeping amendments, and will more clearly identify the benefits to which the justices of the peace are entitled. It also confirms the validity of pension plan payments under the previous act following the amendment of the Justice of the Peace Act. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this is a budget bill and will be discussed fully in committee, so I don't have a lot to add at this point in time, and move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 168, the Justices of the Peace Amendment Act 2019.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 168. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 168, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to join in on Bill number 169. I guess, the legislation that they're bringing forward, they're bringing the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency, my understanding, under different jurisdiction, more power to work with wildfire management, and I know like 911 calls, and looking at different things that, what's that, you're okay? Different ways that they're working with public safety, and I believe right now they handle 911, and I think it's been turned over to their jurisdiction. So when you look at this initial, somebody calls in 911, they're calling in for, I guess, fire services, and they talk about jurisdictions, First Nation. I think about the wildfires we've had up north, and many communities have been impacted for safety, and we worry about the safety. And different agencies, ministry agencies have come in and, they've coordinated efforts, I guess, tried to coordinate. And I don't know, and I'm curious, like in committee, we're going to have a lot of opportunity to ask some questions, because I know there's been challenges, there's been miscommunication, How does it all work? And we want to make sure that residents in this province are kept safe. So anytime you can have agencies working together and consulting, and at the end of the day, for me, I know back home, the leadership, whether it's First Nations, municipal leaders, the Métis leaders, just residents in general, they want to feel like when an emergency happens, and emergencies can happen in many different ways, and different things happen, flooding, fires, different type of emergencies happen. When that happens, you want to make sure that the ministry and those agencies are working with the municipalities, the leadership, First Nations, right through all communities, jurisdictions, that they're communicating to make sure the safety, and that should be the priority. We want to make sure that residents of our province are a priority of all ministries, and of course First Nations, leadership, municipal leadership, Métis leadership. Overall, when you look at different jurisdictions, they want to be working together to make sure that the residents are safe. And this is bringing together, and I know two different agencies, to have certain powers and oversee. And I don't know how that's going to work. I really don't. I don't know if we're going to be looking at job losses. I'm not sure. What will it all bring? And we're going to have a lot of questions to ask in committee, I can just tell, to make sure. Like I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, who is consulted? Will there be job losses? Is this going to impact any of the ministries? And how will it impact them if it is in a negative way? Or is this improving? And of course, if it's something that improves safety for Saskatchewan residents, yes, it's legislation that, yes, you know it's good. We've supported. We've said that before as opposition. When there's legislation that's good, it's working for Saskatchewan residents, we support that, and we'll continue to do that. But we also know that we have to ask some of the tough questions in committee. We have to do the work that we've been asked to do to make sure. And like I said, reaching out to make sure that those individuals that will be impacted by this legislation are consulted. Because unfortunately, we have a government who sometimes introduce so much legislation without consulting, make changes to budgets, make changes to funding, and the list goes on without consulting. And we've seen many times, time again, where this government reverses the decision. It's schools, funding of certain schools, libraries. We've seen the list goes on. I mean, my colleagues and I have come back, and we've had people who stand up. So let's make sure. We can't afford to not get this right. We can't. It's about safety of lives, wildfire management. We look at what's going on. So having said that, I know we'll have a bunch of questions, and we will have those questions in committee asking about how was this brought forward, and how is it recommended that one agency would look after this. And there might be good reasons why the minister and the officials will explain this, and we'll get to ask the questions in committee to find out exactly why, and maybe it's going to be a better system and work better for communications, for jurisdiction. I don't know how it's going to work right now with wildfire management the way it does work, and will they have certain powers over, and I know we're going to have to ask some questions, and there'll be some interesting things. How are they going to coordinate that? You have two ministries, or maybe more than that, when they come together. How will those agencies work in an effective way? And I guess for us, that's what we want to make sure. Saskatchewan residents, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, are taken care of. It is about safety. So when we get into committee, we'll ask a bunch of questions, and we'll find out who did they consult with, will there be jobs, will there be losses, how's this going to work, will there be a certain deputy minister in charge, is it going to be a director in charge, how's it going to work, how will the minister and officials work with different ministries when they come together. So I know we're going to have a lot more questions, so at that point, when we get to committee, we'll ask those questions. I know my colleagues will have more to say. So at this point, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on this bill.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 169. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates, item number 3. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 170, Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Peterson.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to enter in briefly this afternoon to debate with respect to Bill number 171, the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019. A quick glance at this legislation. It appears that they're expanding the definition of mineral commodity by including minerals pertaining to uncertified mineral titles. I was in here yesterday as the member for Regina Northeast. I thought entered into this debate in a very thoughtful way, posing some questions as well as an opportunity to look for a constructive space to improve legislation within the energy space or within the space around that deals with mineral rights holders. So thank you to him for putting those onto the record, and we'll follow up with some of those at committee as well. This legislation, as I read, also establishes the Crown's authority to collect mineral rights tax on uncertified mineral titles. I think we have, certainly there's questions to make sure we fully understand who those individuals are, who those companies are, what precipitated this change, what consultation occurred at that time. Are we talking about mineral rights holders that, might be an individual or part of an estate that gets inherited or part of a farm? Are these mineral rights that are owned by companies involved in the energy sector that are simply held or possibly being explored? And who was consulted in the process? It would appear that this is a new tax, again, of course, from the Sask Party government, Mr. Speaker. We don't know the amount of revenue that would be collected through this mechanism, and it's important for us to get a clear understanding of that and who's impacted and the appropriateness of the changes that have been brought forward. Mr. Speaker, certainly, I can think recently of some of the changes within our energy and within our resource sector, Mr. Speaker, such as the changes to royalties, Mr. Speaker, and it speaks to an approach of this government that is sort of a knows best approach, Mr. Speaker, or one that makes decisions and then consults. And there's a real challenge with that approach, Mr. Speaker. There's a challenge that you don't get legislation or changes that are as effective as they can be. There's a real chance, Mr. Speaker, that unintended consequences aren't understood. And of course, as it related to the changes with the potash taxation of late, Mr. Speaker, we've long advocated for a very thoughtful, even-handed, transparent review, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we get the full return that we can on that resource, but recognizing this is a world-class industry, Mr. Speaker, with many benefits back to Saskatchewan people, and there's an important interplay between the benefits that we receive, Mr. Speaker, the thousands of good jobs that exist within the province that are the livelihoods for so many across the province, the investment that these very good companies, world-class companies, Mr. Speaker, make within the province, and making sure that our environment is competitive so that those companies, multinational companies, can compete within their own corporations for the capital and the investment that we need here in the province. And then, of course, the direct return, the royalty back to Saskatchewan people. And, I was astounded, Mr. Speaker, to see this government unilaterally hike royalties in a fairly significant way without any consultation with the industry at all, Mr. Speaker. I think that that's not how you deal with an important industry like this, and it really creates the potential that government gets wrong the balance or brings forward change that they've created in a vacuum, Mr. Speaker, in isolation, without getting that balance right, Mr. Speaker, which then speaks to the potential of a whole bunch of unintended consequences, Mr. Speaker. So when we're talking about something as important as the potash sector in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that this industry that's been so important to us, certainly historically, that's so important to us today, is there with strength for generations, Mr. Speaker. And certainly we have an incredible resource in this province. We certainly have world-class companies. We certainly have world-class workers Mr. Speaker, but this is an industry that also faces challenges and pressures. They're a long ways from many of our very valued customers. They're incredible in organizing the logistics of transportation to get that product to market. They're certainly a lot further than our competitors, say in Russia, Mr. Speaker, and those that are in Israel, those that are our direct competitors, Mr. Speaker. We also have labor standards and environmental standards that are at a much higher level, Mr. Speaker, and in this case, very efficient mines, very efficient mineral production, Mr. Speaker, because these world-class companies have invested in our province and prioritized these matters as well. And of course, they're facing uncertainty as well with changes federally, Mr. Speaker, the federally imposed carbon tax being one of them, Bill C-69 another, Mr. Speaker, and what we see as a real piling on here, Mr. Speaker, without at the very least having the thoughtful, even-handed review and consultation about how do we maximize certainly the royalty, but the benefits from this very important industry. And I think it's really not how a government should go about working in an important sector like this. In places, certainly creates the potential for unintended consequences for the people of the province when they go at it alone and in a vacuum without consultation with with various experts and those with direct field experience and those with skin in the game, Mr. Speaker, workers in the world-class companies. So I don't know if that's the case with the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act or not, Mr. Speaker. There's certainly, there's a lot of questions that we'll canvass with the Minister at committee as far as what are the impacts, what sort of revenues are being derived, what precipitated this change, Mr. Speaker, who's impacted? Is this an individual who might have inherited a mineral right? Is this a farm that might have mineral rights, Mr. Speaker? Is this an energy company or an exploration company? Who's impacted? What's the take on this front, Mr. Speaker, and what are the consequences? Because certainly whenever you're looking at any taxation changes, Mr. Speaker, you want to understand the justification for those changes and as well sort of the metric of what are the other impacts by adjusting it here, how does that impact other areas? And, I'll lay out an example where that certainly wasn't done by this government, and that's where they went and stuck Saskatchewan people with $1 billion of new PST, Mr. Speaker, actually doubling the take. Very simplistically looking at an industry like construction and thinking that they could just go and really grab more cash out of that industry, Mr. Speaker, thinking that it would just continue to hum along with that same level of activity, Mr. Speaker, not realizing that there would be consequences as we see, Mr. Speaker, not forecasting or understanding that if they hamper and hammer an industry, Mr. Speaker, with a tax like that PST on construction, that there's a lot of other taxes and revenues that don't flow back to the province when Saskatchewan people are forced to move from the province. Construction workers and tradespeople that are proud to build the province that they know and love being forced from here, Mr. Speaker. You lose really good people, for one, Mr. Speaker, who want to build the province they love, but we also lose the income taxes that they pay. We lose the property taxes that they pay. We lose the spend that they put back into the local economy, Mr. Speaker. We lose the dollars that flow back out of profitable businesses that have been gutted by a choice like this. So far too often we've seen the choices of this Sask Party government done in isolation, done without regard for those that they impact, and done in a very narrow, short-sighted sort of a way, Mr. Speaker, without understanding the broader impacts and other impacts as well, Mr. Speaker. I guess just to leave one other area, I don't see changes in this bill, Mr. Speaker, to address the outstanding issue of the Rocanville potash restricted drilling area, Mr. Speaker. And I know the member from Mooseman, I hope, is taking up this cause for the individuals, the mineral rights holders out in Rocanville, Mr. Speaker, who had changes that were made and restricted the drilling within their area, the drilling of their mineral right, Mr. Speaker. and a matter that was certainly important to ensure the integrity of those very important mines, Mr. Speaker, and something that had certainly been committed by the previous NDP government prior to 2007 to be resolved, Mr. Speaker, but something that the incoming Sask Party government and then Premier, opposition leader Brad Wall was very clear when he wrote that committee and said that he was going to fix that as new Premier. I know as well after that, Mr. Speaker, that Bill Boyd had been very clear with that group of mineral rights holders that he was going to fix the problem. Instead, we've watched this government sit on their hands and slow walk any resolution. Meanwhile, mineral rights holders, farmers within that area, Mr. Speaker, have really haven't had a resolution that's fair to them, Mr. Speaker, and they're left with their mineral rights suspended without any compensation, Mr. Speaker. So we'd urge this government to respect that the concerns that have been brought forward by the Rocanville potash restricted drilling area, those mineral rights holders that have been impacted, and to do a little bit of heavy lifting and finally get this resolved in a fair way. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, we'll certainly have lots more to say on the floor here and in through committee, and I'll adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 171, the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 170. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 4. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 171, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into adjourned debates today on Bill number 171, the Income Tax Amendment Act of 2019. I will be brief with my comments today, Mr. Speaker. I know that, but there are a few things that I want to talk about. There are a number of changes being proposed in this act, Mr. Speaker, but some of the more notable ones are the tax credits that are being brought in for volunteer firefighters, volunteer search and rescue, and volunteer emergency medical first responders. So how this is going to work is that if/when this bill passes, beginning with the 2020 tax year, individuals that perform at least 200 hours of eligible volunteer services that are certified by the organization that manages volunteer services will be able to claim a $3,000 tax credit amount. It's timely for us to be talking about tax credits right now, as that is the season that we are in, Mr. Speaker. In order to be an eligible volunteer service, it would consist of responding to and being called on for emergencies, and this includes search and rescue calls, and attending required meetings, and participating in required training. I do want to take a moment to commend my colleague from Regina Rosemont, Mr. Speaker. I understand that he advocated early on and sent a letter to the Finance Minister as it pertains to this particular bill, requesting that, well, first of all, indicating that the official opposition is supportive of this tax change, but also indicating that we had a suggestion in including the volunteer search and rescue into the efforts, acknowledging and recognizing the fact that it is a team effort in response, and he was asking her, I know my colleague from Athabasca read the full letter into the record, but he was asking her to take steps to ensure search and rescue volunteers who complete 200 hours of service are included in the provincial tax credit when this legislation was introduced. We know that there are a number of people that respond to emergencies, so we think that it's prudent to recognize many of these folks, and we know the power of volunteers in our province, Mr. Speaker, and this is part of our culture in Saskatchewan. It runs quite deep, so we're certainly pleased to see that this tax credit is being introduced, Mr. Speaker. I will reserve any further comment on this particular piece of legislation. I know that many of my colleagues will have more to say, and that when we get into committee, the critic will have a lot more questions. But with that, I would move that we adjourn debate for today, Mr. Speaker.
Them's the breaks, man.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 171. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Speaker, I will move this House to not adjourn so the committees can start their good work later today.
It has been moved by the Government House Leader the Assembly do now adjourn. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This Assembly now stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.